You all ready?
Hello, everybody. My name is Meg Starr, and I'm honored to be here today with Jose Lopez, who's been my mentor for years and years. He is the executive director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, which is like an icon within the Chicago Puerto Rican community and the Puerto Rican community writ large from the United States to Puerto Rico. He has spoken many times at the UN Decolonization Committee. He speaks frequently at colleges. He's written the Puerto Rican Nationalism Reader, and he has received so many awards from Hispanic Heritage, the Health and Human Services Awards, and many others as well. Jose, you will steer the course of the discussion, of course, but how about we start with what are some of the aspects here to empowering a community?
Well, I think that first and foremost, in this continent, there's a very old tradition of organizing people. And that tradition begins with the conquest of the Americas over 500 years ago. On the island of Quisqueya in Haiti, which is Spanish called La Española, a woman, an indigenous woman by the name of Ana Caona, led a rebellion against the Spanish occupation. And she finally fled to the mountains that now divide Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And there she established a community of literally indigenous people, Taino people, who had fled with her, but also African people who had been brought as slaves to the La Española. And there begins this amazing experiment that people refer to as the Maroon Societies. It's a word that comes from the Spanish word cimarrón, which literally means wild pigs. And the reason the Spaniards referred to these communities or these people as wild pigs is because they obviously wanted to demonize the resistance against the Spanish occupation. And so we have this example, which replicated all over the Americas. So throughout the Caribbean, throughout Latin America, people who were enslaved or the indigenous people who were obviously facing the occupation of the European armies, literally fled to areas that were far away from the eyes and the ears of the settlers. And they began to create literally what I would consider communities of resistance. That means that they had to sort of create everything that the community needed. So they built literally what later on is referenced to as parallel institutions. What the people needed, they built. They built their own faith traditions. That's where Santeria and Voodoo and Candomblé get their origin. They built their own literary traditions, particularly in poetry, which then turns into the amazing literary trends all over I believe, the American continent, particularly the idea of magical realism, which in many ways has a great deal to do with the study of the mind, and it's much more complex literary tradition. And I think it has its roots in those maroon societies. We're talking about the music that's developed. And so when we study tango in Argentina, or samba in Brazil, or cumbia in Colombia, or guaracha in Cuba, or the let's say the merengue in the Dominican Republic, or the Garifuna musical experiences, or bomba en plena, and even salsa in Puerto Rico, what we're talking about is the emergence of a new kind of music in the Americas, which is driven a great deal by African sounds and rhythms, but it's not completely African. It is indigenous, but it also includes, and all of these cultural expressions includes elements of runaway Europeans who didn't fit in the colonial system. And so obviously we find traditions of the Sephardic Jews who were expelled in 1492, and many of them sought refuge in the Americas. The Moriscos, who were mostly Moors, who were Muslims, who also came to the Americas. And once the Inquisition was established in the Americas, they ran away. So here you have a community of runaway peoples, and these people have to learn to speak a language that was common. They had to learn, they had to create a spiritual tradition that was common. They had to create a common psychological expression of who they were. And so for me, if I want to know what a Colombian is, what a Brazilian is, what an Argentinian is, what is a Puerto Rican or a Cuban or a Dominican or a Mexican, any one of us, I have to go right back to these practices of these communities of resistance that were built almost alongside the colonial system, but alongside this repressive, oppressive system, a practice of freedom and a practice of self-actualization. And I think that model is a very interesting model, because I believe that in today's world, as we look at all the contradictions that we confront today, I believe it is in the third world where we're seeing the emergence of movements and challenges to this dominant colonial structure that began 500 years ago. And the people are literally carrying out practices that are going to be the vanguard of the thinking of the future. And I think Subcomandante Marcos, in his essay, The Seven Pieces of the World of the Global Jigsaw Puzzle, at the end says it is sort of the seventh piece is the pockets of resistance, confronting the empire of the money bag. But I think that tradition has long been practiced in this continent. And I think in many ways, it informs the work that we've done here in Chicago in the Puerto Rican community, a work that has been defined by three principles: the principle of self-determination, self-actualization, and self-reliance. None of them based on a selfish notion of the world. Instead, all of them based on the idea that it is self in the context of the collective self. And it is self in the context of what sort is enshrined in our value system of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. A quote by Consuelo Lee Correger, an amazing Puerto Rican poet, pianist, thinker, and she wrote a poem in which she sort of creates the counter narrative to our sort of the axiom that we're raised with, which is live and let live. In her worldview, that was the world of selfishness, because I live and really the hell with you. Instead, she posits the idea of live and help to live. So if I live and I help to live, I am committed and I have a responsibility to my fellow human being. And but also beyond our fellow human being, we have an incredible responsibility to all living and non-living things in this earth and in this universe. And so I think that for me, the best way to understand any social movement, social practice, or even social change is that it must be informed by a practice and a form of organicness, as well as a content of a holistic approach to any problem. So it is, how do we address anything from the smallest units that we can create to ultimately the entire globe. And that is that everything that we do must be approached from how organic it is and how it addresses a holistic problem.
That provides us with, I know we're being videotaped. My impulse to take my pen and write down important things you said was tremendous during the whole approach. I couldn't help myself. Can you, how would you describe Puerto Rico's current colonial status in a world of imperialism and neo-colonialism? Where does this place the U.S. diaspora and the country?
Well, first and foremost, Puerto Rico is this little tiny island in the Caribbean. And yet, when I look at how amazing Puerto Rico has been, we have some of the greatest writers, some of the greatest thinkers, I believe, and an iconic 21st century figure in the political and cultural angle, Bad Bunny, who has literally transformed youth culture in the world. So this little island has been a center of creative development. And that is because oppressed people everywhere are really, again, the vanguard of freedom, because no oppressed people wants to be oppressed. And so oppressed people are always in search of freedom. And if that's your quest, then everything you do is an act of freedom in whatever elements of cultural expressions you place it. So for me, that's the greatness of Puerto Ricans, but it's the greatness of any oppressed people, right? But I would say that this island has been one of the oldest colonial possessions in the world, dating back from 1493, when Columbus landed on that island, to 2025, when the US is now using Puerto Rico as literally the center of its military command in the Caribbean. And obviously, when you see in the area of a little town like Arroyo, Puerto Rico, yesterday, hundreds of troops being trained, when you see Trident missiles being taken to Puerto Rico, when you see these fighter planes stationed in Puerto Rico, we can envision a Puerto Rico which had been the bulwark of the Spanish Empire for nearly 500, 400 years. If you visit Puerto Rico, and anyone who has visited, you would see this incredible walled city. And you say, why did the Spaniards invest so much in an island which they literally had taken off their colonial endeavors once they discovered the gold and the silver in Mexico and in Peru? Well, because Puerto Rico was literally one of the most important centers of the Spanish global trade. It is the entryway into the Caribbean. And so as you were bringing the Spanish galleons, they would have to pass through Puerto Rico. And that meant that they would then leave Puerto Rico. They would never land in Puerto Rico. They were obviously the defense system, the headquarters was Puerto Rico. It would move through the Caribbean into Grenada, into then Colombia, and then obviously throughout the Caribbean, ending up in Veracruz. So if you study the Spanish galleons, they would go literally from Cadiz, move down into the Caribbean. Puerto Rico was the easternmost possession of Spain. It would come down, they would enter the Caribbean, go and pass, obviously, the fortifications that were built in Grenada, then the fortifications in Cartagena, Colombia, you would get all the trade from the areas that today are Venezuela and Colombia. From there, you would move to Panama, where you would get all of the goods that would come via the Pacific, starting in Lima or Callao. You would carry those goods overland on the strip of Panama, and then from there to Veracruz. In Veracruz, you would send those goods via mules to Mexico City, but then it would end up in the Pacific, Mexico, and from there you would bring the Manila galleon that came from Manila. This was a worldwide system of trade, and Puerto Rico played a very pivotal role in maintaining that flow of trade from getting attacked by the European imperial powers. And remember, Spain is taking incredible amount of wealth into Europe, which really was the factor. The monetizing of gold and silver was really the factor that made Europe developed and caused the underdevelopment of the Western world. So Puerto Rico was pivotal in building modern colonialism and in building modern capitalism. And so when we look at the world today, and when we look at particularly at the US and its imperial designs, particularly once again on Latin America, Puerto Rico becomes an amazing place, an amazing pivotal role in that imperial endeavor. And so Puerto Rico is facing an amazing crisis of militarism, the militarization of the island, and at the same time, Puerto Rico is facing an amazing process of spatial deconcentration through obviously making Puerto Rico a haven for very rich North Americans who can go to Puerto Rico, get rid of their tax burdens in the US, use Puerto Rico as a tax haven, and obviously reside in Puerto Rico for 6 months and have a settler system in Puerto Rico that now has these very wealthy people in areas like Dorado, Luquillo, Rincon, and literally they don't even have to travel. All they have to do is take a little airplane right to the airport, or in Aguadilla, take a little plane out of Aguadilla Airport, and literally they don't have to confront any of the social realities of Puerto Rico because they're literally flying back and forth, and they're living in these gorgeous, beautiful landed estates that are reminiscent of probably the old settler plantation systems that were created throughout the world. So I think that right now Puerto Rico is in a huge crisis. There are 3.2 million Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, almost 5.8 million Puerto Ricans in the United States. So we're seeing Puerto Rico's population changing very rapidly. We're seeing settlers moving in, Puerto Ricans moving out, and obviously literally trying to create the end of the Puerto Rican nation and the Puerto Rican identity. And so for us here in the diaspora, it is a challenge and a historical obligation to make sure that Puerto Rican culture thrives and continues to develop, and obviously new dimensions are added to it. So for us, the idea of creating communities that are stable, that are self-actualized, that are self-reliant, is part of the work that we're doing here. And we want that work obviously to be tied to Puerto Rico, and for there to be this continuous bridge between Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican diaspora, that at some point in time, just like the Irish in 1916, when the Easter Rebellion takes place and proclaimed the independence of Ireland, and in their proclamation they said, we proclaim the independence of Ireland and her children in America. What an amazing moment when you look at history and the role of the diaspora in leading. Literally, that moment led to a free Ireland. And so for me, I see the role of the Puerto Ricans in that context. But I think in the world, the role of the diasporas inside of the imperial centers is also very important. There's no doubt in my mind that the world's position on Palestine changed when the United Nations, in an overwhelming vote that has never been seen, obviously proclaimed the existence of the nation of Palestine as a juridically recognized entity. And a lot had to do with that Palestinian diasporas everywhere. And I believe that the Palestinian diaspora is right now the backbone of why Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and most of the Arab world has had to really deal with the reality that they have to defend the existence of Palestine. But the history of diasporas, I believe, are everywhere to be seen. We could see it in what the Vietnamese Revolution literally was informed by leaders who had literally left, including Ho Chi Minh, who had left Vietnam and went to France, or the role of the Algerians inside of France in the quest for Algerian independence. And I think all over the world, I think we can see these elements of the role of diasporas. But I want to come back to the question of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is one of the last remaining direct colonies. It doesn't mean we have ended colonialism. I think for me, it is important to say that after the Second World War, all over the world, national liberation movements emerged. And we could have whatever critique we want of those national liberation movements. But to me, it was one of the greatest challenges to the modern systems of oppression. So there may be lots of things to criticize about what has happened in many of the nation states that have been built as a result of the national liberation struggle. Yet, the fact that they were able to challenge that colonial system and to have some level of success, I think really call modern colonialism into a question like it had never been questioned before. Nobody was questioning colonialism in the 19th century, and it was there in the 18th century, in the 17th century. It took the 20th century to do that. But I also think that one of the problems in many of the nation states is that those nation states, their borders were also informed by colonial practices. So throughout the world, I think the most prevalent form of colonialism is internal colonialism. And I think when we look at Timor as an example, and we look at the independence movement of Timor, we look at obviously the independence movement of Indonesia. The fact is that the people of Timor were ethnically and every way different, said, no, we want our self-determination. So you had a problem in terms of Indonesia, of a problem of internal colonialism. And I could go all over the world and see this problem prevalent in almost every nation state. We see it in Iraq, we see it in Syria, we see it in Turkey. We see it in the United States with all the indigenous nations here who constitute a form of internal colonialism. We see it with Black America when Black people in this country develop sort of a psychological makeup of a Black nation, particularly in the Deep South and in the Mississippi Delta. So for me, all over the five states that constitute the old part of the old Confederacy, there is something there that speaks to what John Waltney in his book Dry Long Soul states in his book. This was an amazing African American anthropologist, and his vision is that there's something unique in the language, in the structure of everything that's African American, that he called Dry Long Soul, that speaks to that. So for me, the idea of internal colonialism is obviously one of the grave problems of the world today, everywhere in the world. And we have to address them, whether it is the Maori people in New Zealand or the people, the original people of Australia, whether it's people in some of these very small islands where you have several identities that feel that they have not been self-determined. I believe that in the world today, there are probably somewhere around 3,500 nationalities that want to be self-determined. And I think that's something that we have to work towards. At the same time, and that doesn't necessarily, self-determination in some of these contexts does not mean a separate nation state. Because I think we've created the nation state as the answer to the world's problems. No, it isn't. There are other ways in people can coexist. And I think it's in that coexistence that we could begin to talk about ultimately real self-determination, not necessarily in creating prisons of nationalities. That is, in many cases, what the modern nation state is. So we have to rethink what that means and how people reorganize themselves. So I think that obviously the world today is defined by three forms of colonialism. In the case of Puerto Rico, it is direct colonialism. In obviously, in the case of all these nationalities, it is internal colonialism. And in most of the world, in terms of the nation state, it is neocolonialism. So we've got a lot of work to do in the world against the empire of the money bag.
Wow, but go on.
Pause.
Yeah.
Get a drink of water.
Yeah.
It was amazing. Jose, much has been discussed about the nonprofit industrial complex, and I'm wondering how, in your local work, do you work with nonprofit organizations and continue to build movements?
Well, I think the idea of non-for-profit is that it gives you a sort of a legal recognition. Obviously, for me, you know, we have to envision the world in which we exist in, sometimes we exist in a system, And we are building without the system outside of it. And there's got to be points of encounters. And I believe that we need to be very mature about it. So we can throw the baby with the water in terms of saying non-for-profits are tainted by who gives them money and who, that's somewhat true. I'm not going to negate it. However, what is also true is your ability to survive and to grow. We don't have the controls of the sort of possibilities of expanding unless you have some resources. And our people, many times, do not have those resources. So how do you build something that recognizes the limitations of what you're doing, but also must be deeply rooted in a practice of freedom? And I think that is the challenge for a lot of us, that we got to figure that out and try to finesse that in some way. So for me, the idea is we own some property here. And that means that we have, we're able to provide housing for people that is extremely, extremely low. I mean, most of the apartments we have here that we rent are below what people would think would be the poverty level for people to be able to pay the rent. What does that mean? In an area like this where you have high taxes, high insurance, all kinds of burdens on that property, you have to try to somehow subsidize the properties. And that means that you have to have a way to meet the needs of maintaining that population living here. And so the non-for-profits status helps us to, get foundation, get government funding. And so we use it, but it's used for the advancement of the community. And, some people have criticized, for example, historically, the Maroon societies, because the Maroon societies actually had connections to the system at that time. So I can tell you that, I'm just giving you an example of Puerto Rico. The area of Loíza in Puerto Rico is an Afro center area in Puerto Rico where lots of the slaves created a Maroon society. And it was literally on the near the ocean, right? Because that was sort of area nobody wanted to live at that time. And these were the mangroves. The people living there used to take the wood, burn the wood, and make coal out of the wood. They would then sell it to the rich people in San Juan so they could cook their food, they could iron their clothing, everything the coal, they sold it. So they maintained an economy, but they were trading literally with what would be considered the enemy. And some people have criticized them. But I think those are the kinds of things that we have to understand happens in the real world. And how do you keep your principles and your values at the same time that you recognize the limitations as well? And be honest about it. So I think that's the world of the non-for-profit. If you're truly non-for-profit that's deeply rooted in the community, not all non-for-profits are that way either. You have a lot of non-for-profits. There are non-for-profits that provide a lot of jobs for very wealthy people. And it becomes literally another manifestation of the kinds of in sort of what we could call an industrial complex that or an economic complex for some very wealthy people to continue to have, you know, CEOs that make as much as in the private sector, that kind of thing. So I think you got to be able to be very clear about your values. But what we're seeing in the United States right now is a huge attack on non-profit, a huge attack on NGOs. That means somebody is feeling threatened by them, and it means that we have to defend non-for-profits and NGOs, regardless of whatever criticisms we have. If we don't do that, then we're lending ourselves to creating more divisions, because in many ways we're looking at our own issues and criticizing them and not looking at the big picture. So for me, that's very clear that today non-for-profits in this country are literally going, in many ways, are going to confront some major challenges. And particularly because what you do is the work that we do will then be sort of transferred to the so-called faith-based initiatives that then are obviously geared towards maintaining the social structure. So a lot of the evangelical churches are getting a lot of money that is now government money in education, in other areas, to sort of meet the needs of people who are dispossessed. And so that is a huge crisis that I think we're facing right now. I think the same question that we pose for non-for-profits and the challenge is the same thing we can talk about electoral politics. Electoral politics in the world has been defined by the French Revolution, and it's all defined who's to the left and who's to the right. And I'm always leery of the kind of political vision, because the French Revolution ended up with the reign of terror. Because, by the way, most revolutions in the world end up, and then you end up creating something which looks almost the same as the old regime you were trying to overthrow, because then you're institutionalizing the revolution, and then your goal is to keep the revolution as an entity that becomes a structure. So for me, that's something that I'm very critical of in terms of how we see politics. Among the ancient people of the world, among the original people, politics was a very interesting practice. First of all, it was based on the persons who could have the greatest sort of understanding of speech that could convince most of the people to reach consensus. It was never through representation. Representation is a modern construction of politics. The old politics of communal societies and of indigenous society was that the speaker usually was a speaker, would be able to convince the people that this is the best course of action. But that person was also sort of, people often see them as the shamans, as the sort of the chiefs. And I said, what a mistaken view, because that is totally a Eurocentric perspective of leadership. Leadership is not about someone's ego thinking process. It is about being able to address people's needs and wants and vision. And that's only done when you understand organically people's problems and you find solutions that are holistic. That's what a shaman did. And shamans were people who also were trained many times by the elders to be able to communicate with the people. Again, we think of when we use the word polis, which by the way also means city, but it is your ability to gather somewhere where in the Greek world it was the agora and you could debate and discuss. But the idea was an ancient idea of politics. And I think we have to go back to that idea of politics, that you have to be able to find the people who have the interest of the people at heart. And I'm going to say something which may be a little bit problematic, and that is that much of the left in this country and in much of the world has been defined again by this vision of the left and the right, based on a political model of what is progressive. What may be progressive for some may be regressive for others. And so we have to be very careful with that and how we understand those things, right? And how we understand carrying out a political vision about public education, let's say, without saying everybody has a right to read and write and learn all those things, but everybody has a right to read and write things that make sense to them. And so I often tell people that one of the problems I have, and here goes another thing that may be very problematic, but I'm going to say, and that is that while I support unions, when you get to teachers' unions, it's quite problematic. And why would I say that? Because for me, when I see a teachers' union which has a plank which states sometimes teachers have to be uncomfortable in order for his or her students to be comfortable. Sometimes teachers have to be uncomfortable in order for the community that they serve to feel comfortable. I've never seen that plank. I always see a plank about salaries, about what makes your working conditions better. And sometimes there are things about housing, but it's very limited. And we have to be honest about that. So for me, one thing or the other, we have to be very careful how we interpret progressive politics. For me, the issue of colonialism is an extremely important issue. When there are very progressive people who say, well, Puerto Rico should be made into a state because this would augment the progressive sector in this country, right? I mean, Puerto Rico would end up with 2 senators in the US Senate, with maybe 5 representatives in Congress. Wow, this is a good, that is not good for Puerto Rico. Statehood, the assimilation of the Puerto Rican nation is not good for the Puerto Rican people. So I think, when we look at colonialism, when we look at the issue of, we try to say the problem in this country is one of class and not necessarily race, there's an issue there. So for me, what defines progressive is extremely important. And so for me, what defines a progressive elected official is someone who's been in the trenches, who understands the psyche of the people, who has the best interest of that community as front and center, and who is able to convene the community and is able to win the communities by a form of general will, if you say, because a general will is not based on 51% of the vote. It cannot be. A general will has to be a consensus. And indigenous people all over the world, I believe, were always working in the political realm within the context of consensus.
That's a good high standard. And I know you guys have been able to work with local officials in that kind of context.
Yes, I think that I can tell you that in around 1983, 84, Congressman Luis Gutierrez carved out the 26th ward as a majority Puerto Rican ward. And I can tell you that we have had 4 aldermen, including him, Luis Gutierrez, Billy Ocasio, Roberto Maldonado, and now Jesse Fuentes, all who came from the trenches, understood what we needed to do, and understood the nexus of Puerto Ricans here with Puerto Rico. And so it's 40 years of a legacy of an electoral practice that talks about organicness and about the idea of that we have to center ourselves in understanding the wholeness of problem solving.
I've been speaking about making this as international and universal as possible, but I think here it's worth talking a little bit about Chicago. Yeah? 2 things to say from this left, false left, what is left, and what is progressive perspective. We know that it was the movement here in Chicago, a little bit in New York, a lot on the island, to free the many Puerto Rican prisoners over decades. that was not only clearly a left campaign, and when they were captured, this was a big left issue that some people, even in the progressive community, didn't accept, because these were national liberation heroes that were not seen as heroes by the entire so-called left. But it was ultimately some of these elected officials, including Congressman Gutierrez, including Melissa Marcovietto in New York, and many elected officials in Puerto Rico, who, by the time that your brother, that Oscar Lopez Rivera, was released, went far beyond what anyone could call the left or even independentistas, and transcended the entire the polis, the entire political space of the island, what one could call left, right, and center. And those elected officials played a key role, so that at this moment in 2025, there are no Puerto Rican political prisoners. And that's can't be said by other movements. So I think looking at that history, what I want to hear a little bit more about this, I think it's a very special case, both that history, but also this moment with Jessie. Because I think what Jessie represents and what she's done, deeply from the community, as the others before her, but also in solidarity with other peoples, is an important example for people to know about in 2025, and people don't know that story.
Well, I first and foremost, Jesse Fuentes is the 26th Ward alderperson. And Jesse graduated from our high school, Pedro Albizu Campos. She literally went into the trenches of the struggle to free the political prisoner. Actually, she was one of the leaders of the movement to free the political prisoners at the end. So Jesse comes out of an experience here that was obviously deeply rooted in our political practice. But Jesse is also a child of the realities of colonialism. Her father spent many years in prison. Her mother was a drug addict. Her brothers, almost all of them, went to prison. And yet, she was able to become the kind of leader that she is today because there was a community that embraced her, that literally wrapped their hands around her and guided her to where she's at today. And I think that's something that also we have to learn. That it's not only about teaching political education or about engaging people in, let's say, political classes, or engaging them in a rally or in a march. It's also about understanding the psychological trauma that colonial and colonized young people face. So for me, I think one of the things that I love about the work that we do is that I can point out to a whole bunch of people who are today actively engaged in our work in the cultural center, who are literally products of a system of oppression that did not give them any opportunities. And because of the work that we did, those people are now leading the work here. And so for me, that is the most humbling, but it is also the most sort of deeply emotional, speaks to the deepest emotions in me, to be able to see that we have made a dent. I always tell people there are two words that are extremely important in education. One is that an educational process must be affective, meaning it is loving and caring. That's what Paulo Freire calls the pedagogy of love. And two, it must be effective. The word effective comes from the Latin word effectare, which means to make a dent. Every human being wants to make a dent. What we need to do with our young people is how do we work with them through their own creativity, their own imagination, so they can make a dent in whatever they choose to do. And ultimately, that dent is informed by becoming responsible agents of change.
Exactly. And I'll just say this for people who don't know. Part of what's inspiring from a distance, not as far away as Aotearoa, New Zealand, but even from the distance of New York, about Jessie, is that she can be and is a grand symbol and leader of the Puerto Rican community here in the 24th Ward and in the Puerto Rican community in Chicago writ large, and a symbol of the LGBTQ communities, and there's no contradiction. Excellent. And it's not one or the other, and it's not her who invented it, and it's not based on her as an individual. It's based on the community you built. And I'll also say, again, for people who don't know, she just recently made headlines all the way across the country for getting arrested. One of the few elected officials, not the only, there was someone in Newark and one of the New Yorkers, but one of the few elected officials who stood up and got arrested in the face of these ICE. And we know that ICE is not mainly coming after Puerto Ricans in this community who have their paperwork and who have a mobilized community around them. They're looking at the more vulnerable, especially Mexicans who don't have a U.S. paperwork. But Jessie was there getting arrested because, again, the leadership and the continuity, Mexico and Puerto Rico, not a contradiction here, but actually part of a seamless thread of unity and broad unity. And to me, those two pieces of what Jessie symbolizes in terms of what this community has built in the way it's approached solidarity, unity, politics is exemplary.
One thing that is that Jessie was detained and covered, they didn't arrest her, so I make sure. But she was willing to face the consequences is what is important. But I think one of the things that speaks to who Jessie is, that her father is Cuban, her mother is Puerto Rican, and her father was a Marielito, and it's not of the Cuban elite. So he faced a lot of problems. But one of the things that I think our work has demonstrated is that it has to be centered on the idea of a work that's informed by solidarity. One of the things that I think is extremely important in understanding our work, it's that I said it was deeply rooted in that sort of ancient practice of the Maroon societies. And one of the things about Maroon society was the incredible sense of solidarity. I often tell people that when we look at the independence movement of Latin America, there would be almost no independence movement in Latin America without the support of the Haitian Revolution. As a matter of fact, one of the greatest moments of Simón Bolívar's life was to live in exile in Haiti, going back with ships filled with arms to South America. And in the process, wrote one of the greatest political theses called A Letter to a Jamaican Gentleman. in which he articulated the idea of the Confederation of the Antilles. And within that context, we have to look at Simon Bolivar's vision of a unified Latin America. And I think what is important about this is that the Haitian Revolution was not a revolution of Black Jacobins. It was a revolution of Haitians, because deeply rooted in the Maroon societies. I often tell people that before there was a Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, there was a Macandal in Haiti. And Macandal became the symbol of Haitian resistance way before Toussaint Louverture. And Macandal was a leader of the Maroon society. So I think it's important to understand that process of solidarity that's deeply rooted in Maroon practices in the Caribbean and Latin America, to understand what informs the work here and how Jesse is a product of that practice. One of the things that people may not know is that we were the only organization and the only community to have kept 4 Mexican undocumented women in sanctuary right here in this community. And it began with Elvira Arellano in, I believe it was 2003, to obviously maybe 5 years ago with Francisca Lino. And I say this with obviously a lot of pride, because when Elvira Arellano took refuge in this little storefront church here in Humboldt Park, we placed 2 people in front of that church with a Mexican and a Puerto Rican flag for weeks, 24/7, keeping guards over Elvira. And more importantly, that we were able to take her son and give him an education, and he graduated from our high school. And Jesse was formed in that practice of Elvira and sanctuary. So for her, it was not something that was foreign, it was something that was natural for her to have faced these ICE agents and to say, you know, you are not going to be able to arrest me because you have no basis to arrest me. And I believe that her question to the ICE agents is, what? This is a man who had broken his leg, who they were chasing. They took him into the hospital. The hospital freaked out. They started to give him care, but they called Jesse's office. And Jesse went over there and she says, where is your warrant? What do you have for this man to be treating him like that? And the guy got really upset. I don't have to answer. I don't. But this is the reality that we're living. It's the reality of a state of terror. And I think it's people like Jesse and other elected officials, including, I believe, in this case, the governor of the state of Illinois, the mayor of Chicago, they have really stood up against this state of terror.
Well, you've spoken to many of the main concerns of this time, and you've pinpointed people. Is there anything else about what gives you hope that you want to speak to?
Albert Camus once wrote, in the midst of winter, there is a summer inside of me. And I believe that when we think that way, is that everything in the world is based on contradictions. And it's how we navigate those contradictions and how we challenge those situations that I think we find mindfulness. And I think every form of struggle against the state of terror in the United States, the imperial system that the United States wants to recreate, particularly in the Americas, those are the things that give me hope, because those pockets of resistance really speaks to the future of the confrontation, pockets of resistance confronting the empire of the money.
Thank you very much. I believe that our interview is concluded. We've taken so much of your precious time. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.